and welcome to China's Living Legends.
欢迎来到我的频道。
Imagine a world where your destiny wasn't just influenced, but like sealed the moment you drew your first breath. Your family name, your lineage, that dictates every single path you could ever hope to take. It's hard to picture, right?
Yeah, totally.
Picture a system forged over centuries, designed to fundamentally shatter that. A revolutionary experiment, really, that dared to open doors, not based on who your father was, but purely on what you knew, how sharp your mind was. Today on The Deep Dive, we're plunging into one of history's most enduring and maybe most subtle social transformations. China's Imperial Examination system.
KeJu.
Yeah, it literally translates to selection by subject. For our listeners, think of it like the ultimate national college entrance exam, but the stakes way higher. We're talking direct pathway into high-ranking government jobs.
Wow, not just university, but running the country.
Pretty much. And its core intent was incredibly forward-thinking for its time. The idea was to identify and elevate talented people from any background into state service. But for this to really work, for KeJu to be like open for business, two critical things had to happen.
Okay.
First, knowledge needed to be sort of compartmentalized, divided into subjects you could actually test formally. And second, and this is really key, it had to be based on self-application. No recommendations. You had to put yourself forward.
Right, you had to step up yourself. And our mission for this deep dive is to trace that extraordinary journey. We're going to uncover how this system didn't just transform Chinese society, but how it really reshaped ambition itself. We'll explore what it promised millions and, well, like all big experiments, some of the unexpected costs it exacted too. You're going to discover how this one system became this real fulcrum of power, intellectual identity, and just personal destiny for over 1,000 years. It was all about shattering birthright with pure brain power.
And from the emperor's perspective,
KeJu
was an absolute masterstroke, strategically genius. It was this incredibly potent tool to consolidate authority, you see, to skillfully sideline the old guard, the hereditary aristocracy, and assert direct imperial rule.
Taking back control.
Exactly. Emperor Taizong of the Tang Dynasty, he famously said, "All the heroes of the world are in my grasp." It just rings with this cunning of a ruler who got that loyalty earned through opportunity, much stronger than loyalty just inherited.
Yeah, makes sense.
There's even a saying from back then, Emperor Taizong's long-term strategy indeed, luring heroes until their hair turns white. He was essentially building this whole new bureaucracy, completely loyal to him.
And from the commoner's side, imagine the sheer allure. For centuries, KeJu offered this tantalizing ladder. Social mobility, there's that phrase. A farmer's boy in the morning and in the emperor's hall by evening.
It's a powerful image.
Isn't it? Think about that jump. It promised to replace the iron grip of noble birth with just the boundless potential of your own ability. This wasn't just a pathway. For talented commoners, it was really the pathway out of obscurity, a chance to escape the life your parents had.
But hang on a second. Didn't Confucius himself argue for picking officials from common people based on merit? I'm thinking of Mencius talking about appointing the worthy without regard to their background, or Confucius saying, in teaching, there should be no distinction of classes. That sounds like meritocracy 101.
But this brings up a really crucial point about what Confucius actually intended. And it's often misunderstood. Those quotes sound like meritocracy to us now, sure. But Confucius was, in fact, a staunch defender of the existing feudal system of his time. His idea about commoners mastering rites and music before becoming officials, that wasn't about getting rid of the aristocracy.
No, so he wasn't trying to elevate commoners above the nobility or tear down the social order?
Not at all. His main worry was preventing the collapse of those very rites and music, the traditional social order. He wanted to preserve it. His goal was to supplement the aristocratic class with talented commoners who understood the rules, to strengthen the feudal structure. Not to create a class of scholars who would become, the king's henchmen to suppress the nobility. That wasn't his aim.
Wow, okay, that's a massive distinction. And what about that idealized abdication system from mythology? The sage kings like Yao and Shen choosing successors based purely on worth, not blood.
That's another good point for clarification. The abdication system myth was specifically about the transfer of the absolute highest political power, the emperorship itself, from one sage king to another, based on wisdom. It wasn't really a model for how to distribute everyday government jobs between the king and the nobility within an ongoing system. It was about that ultimate top-level transfer.
I see the difference. So Confucius's actual ideal, summed up as restrain oneself and return to the rights, was really about restoring a feudal system where power, titles, jobs, they were meant to be hereditary, passed down within families.
Precisely. He envisioned a stable hierarchy where aristocratic families held their positions as long as they respected the ruler and upheld tradition. The whole KeJu idea that someone could become a top official just by passing exams with zero family background, that was fundamentally not Confucius's vision.
So what does this all mean for how we see the KeJu system, this whole massive engine of examination-based meritocracy, where capital other than ability is zero, as the saying goes, was actually the exact opposite of Confucius's ideal of hereditary feudalism?
It fundamentally twisted the philosophy it claimed to uphold.
Repurposing it for the emperor's goals.
Exactly. And that ultimately shows us the real driving force behind
科举
It wasn't some pure philosophical ideal or even public good, as we might think of it. It was the emperor's relentless, centuries-long push to shift from indirect rule relying on nobles to direct rule. It was this long, gradual, grayscale process moving away from bloodline towards ability, but always, always for the sake of centralized imperial control.
Essentially aligning itself with what the rulers wanted, and in return, it got exclusive access to official positions, a seat at the table. But the consequence, the sort of domestication of the intellectual elite, was their absence or maybe quiet complicity during big power shifts.
Like when?
Think about Emperor Taizong of Song, a military guy, not very cultured. Or Zhu Yonzang of Ming, who came from really humble beginnings, barely educated. The intellectuals, the Confucian scholars, they often failed to really guide things in those crucial moments. It seems like they were too tied to the system that lifted them up.
That really cuts to the core, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It wasn't just about finding talent. It was about shaping loyalty. That subtle pressure. Your whole future, your family's future, depending on the state recognizing you. It makes you wonder, this alliance with commoners, designed to counter the nobles, did it ever backfire on the emperors?
That's a great question, and it's a dynamic you see again and again in history. Rulers often use new blood to counter old power.
Wow.
Look at Duke Mu of Qin using foreign advisors, outsiders, right, to boost his rule.
Okay.
Or Henry VIII relying on Thomas Cromwell. Lowborn guy becomes the king's right-hand man precisely because he wasn't tied to the old aristocracy.
Ah, I see the pattern.
And even more formally, you had the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, the Ottoman Empire, taking kids from poor Christian families, raising them in the palace, training them for top jobs, all incredibly effective ways to cut down the power of the hereditary nobles. It's a recurring theme. The ruler's genius, turning scholars or outsiders into loyal tools.
A powerful, often ruthless pattern. But this idea of pure meritocracy, talent alone, it wasn't an overnight thing, was it? This road to the real KeJu system was like super rocky. Centuries of trial and error.
Definitely not overnight.
Let's look at what came before. A time when jobs were mostly hereditary. Get this story from the spring and autumn period. KeJu assassinates his lord. The grand historian, the scribe, writes it down. KeJu assassinated his lord. Fearless.
Gutsy move.
Totally. KeJu has him killed. But his second brother steps up, takes the pen, writes the exact same thing. He gets killed too. Then the third brother comes and does it again.
Wow. Why?
Because they just assumed they'd inherit their brother's job. Is their birthright to be the historian, even if it meant certain death. Shows how deep that hereditary idea ran.
That really paints a picture. So the Han Dynasty tried something early on. The recommendation system, Zhuzi, Emperor Wen, put out these edicts calling for outstanding talents, virtue, scholarship, law, strategy. People to educate, improve laws, serve locally. It was a first step, recognizing talent beyond just bloodlines.
And this got formalized later under Emperor He, with quotas based on population, like one person recommended for every 200,000 people in a big area.
Exactly.
On paper, that sounds, structured, progress maybe. But human nature, it finds loopholes, doesn't it?
Absolutely. And this is where you see the big flaws in just relying on recommendations. Cheating, cronyism, it was rampant. Imagine you're a local official responsible for 1 million people. You need to recommend 5.
Okay.
Then 5 powerful guys from the capital each send you a note. Hey, my brother-in-law lives in your district. What do you do?
Oh, man, the pressure.
Huge pressure. And then you've got the powerful local families expecting their people to get ahead, too. So the really deserving local scholars often just squeezed out. This constant fight between central and local elites, it directly fed into the disasters of the partisan prohibitions at the end of the Eastern Han. Major political chaos.
Right. So Cao Pai, later Emperor Wen of Wei, he tries to fix this mess with the nine-rank system, the Jupenzhenzi. The idea was the arbiters, the recommenders, had to be locals, to make sure they knew the local talent weren't just puppets for the capital elites.
Seems logical, but the irony here is just profound. This system, meant to curb the old aristocracy, did the exact opposite. These local arbiters, they were often part of or totally indebted to the big local magnate families anyway.
Oh, no.
Yeah, they started monopolizing appointments. They basically turned themselves into a new aristocracy. It created this stark divide summed up in that saying, in the upper ranks, there are no poor families. In the lower ranks, there are no powerful clans.
Wow.
Your starting position was fixed by your family rank, not what you could do. The whole system became unsustainable because everyone was getting these second-rank home region certificates, but there weren't enough top jobs to go around. The fatal flaw. Merit became a family business again.
So you've got this broken system. And different parts of China react differently, right? The southern dynasties, the emperors there were kind of weak, fleeing south.
Yeah.
They just appeased the powerful clans.
Pretty much. They were sort of helpless against these entrenched families. But the northern dynasties, ruled by these nomadic conquerors, they were much more assertive.
How so?
Well, as they shifted to farming, setting up things like the equal field system, they actively wanted to sideline their own powerful horse-riding nobles. They needed a new way to run things, a new source of loyal officials.
And they weren't shy about it. I read about northern key emperors personally overseeing exams right in court. And the punishments. Just brutal. If your handwriting was bad, you might be forced to drink a liter of ink on the spot.
Can you imagine?
No. Gulping down ink in front of everyone. The public humiliation. It wasn't just about passing. It was about absolute perfection and total submission.
That relentless push, that assertiveness, it leads to the real breakthrough under the Sui dynasty. Emperor Wen's decree in 583 CE. Revolutionary. He basically abolished those local arbiter jobs and centralized all official appointments in the capital.
Ah, the final cut.
Exactly. Many historians see this as the true birth of the KeJu system we're talking about. A clean break from local patronage, from hereditary influence.
And this marks that huge shift, right? From private recommendations to self-application. If you wanted the job, if you believed you had the smarts, you had to fund your own trip to the capital, you had to take the exam. Imagine the journey. Thousands of hopeful scholars pouring into the capital, all driven by that one burning desire. It put the responsibility and the ambition squarely on the individual.
Precisely. So with that shift to self-application, plus the formal division of tests into subjects, those two essential conditions were finally met. KeJu was, as the sources say, officially open for business. This wasn't just reform, it was a revolution in how talent was found and used.
Then the Tang Dynasty comes along and really embraces this, expands it massively. Emperor Gaozu lets commoners participate. So you get thousands flooding the capital every year for these exams. It must have been an incredible buzz, this palpable sense of ambition, intellectual energy.
It must have been. And the Tang exams had different flavors. The most prestigious initially was the Shukai cultivated talent, focused on policy. But the pass rate was ridiculously low, like 1 or 2 people a year sometimes, so it faded out.
Too hard.
Way too hard. The Jinshi, or presented scholar, became the really glorious one. This emphasized classics, poetry, rhyming prose. This is why we often say the Tang picked officials based on literary flair. They almost turned governing into an art form.
Interesting.
Then you had the Ming, understanding the classics. More about rote memorization, reading comprehension. If you only mastered one classic for this, you might get called an old pedant. A bit dismissive,
Huh? Old pedant. So with this big shift to self-application, it wasn't just about being smart anymore, was it? Sounds like you also needed serious self-promotion skills. These circulating scrolls, basically portfolios of your best work, sent to officials hoping for patronage.
Yeah, it was less like pure scholarship and maybe more like a high-stakes networking game.
Right. And lots of famous Tang poems we still read actually came from these scrolls, like Zhangji's The Moon Sets, A Crow Caws, Frost Fills the Sky. These weren't just poems, they were like career tools, designed to catch a powerful person's eye.
It's a really interesting side effect, and this intense self-promotion, it even changed art itself. Poetry got so saturated, everyone was sending verses, right? So some scholars started sending short stories, these twanky tales of the marvelous, just to stand out.
Trying something different.
Exactly. The writer Lu Sun noted, when poetry got too common, people got tired of it. They wanted something new to the eye and ear. So the pressure of the system actually helped foster new literary forms.
Yeah.
Wild, huh?
That is wild. But this new meritocracy, it must have stirred things up socially. The old aristocracy still hanging around. They looked down on these commoner Jinshi, didn't they?
Oh, absolutely. Disdain is probably the right word. And their own sons could still become officials through shadow privilege, Rensni, a leftover from the old feudal ways, no exam needed.
Ugh. Imagine the frustration, spending years, maybe decades, hitting the books, mastering classics, finally passing that grueling Jinshi exam, only to see some noble's kid, maybe not even that bright, just waltz into a top job because of his name.
Resentment must have been intense, and it absolutely was. It led to this major factional struggle in the Tang court, the Renzi party, the hereditary officials versus the Jinshi party, the exam grads.
Showdown.
Pretty much. And initially, the Jinshis were only maybe 10% of officials, so you had all this talent, all this ambition from commoners being blocked. And the result? Deep dissatisfaction. Many talented guys, seeing no future in the capital, went off to serve those regional military governors, the Jidushi.
Which helped them get stronger.
Exactly. It inadvertently fueled the rise of these regional powers, which later became uncontrollable and weakened the central government. It almost undermined the whole system that created these talented officials in the first place.
Wow, it's such a tragic parallel, isn't it? This newly factional strife in the late Tang between the old guard and the new meritocrats. It sounds just like the disasters of the partisan prohibitions centuries before.
It's the same fundamental tension, both rooted in the emperor wanting direct rule, wanting to break the power of the aristocracy. It's this recurring clash. Imperial ambition versus entrenched power, again and again.
So what happened after all that Tang turmoil?
Well, the ultimate result was mutual devastation. Both the Guanlong bloc, where the imperial family originally came from, and those powerful eastern aristocratic clans were just wiped out, politically speaking.
A total reset.
A brutal reset. It led to that evocative line. The swallows from the halls of Wang and Ji now fly into the homes of common folk. The great noble families were finally gone, their influence shattered, and that cleared the path for the KeJu system's real golden age in the Song Dynasty. The aristocracy's downfall paved the way for merit, pure and simple, or at least purer than before.
What a journey. We've gone through centuries of ambition, fierce power struggles, and that deep, enduring human desire for a chance to rise, right? To be judged on your merits. The Imperial Examination system, born from conflict, evolving through necessity. It didn't just reshape an empire. It fundamentally redefined merit itself for over 1,000 years. It promised a level playing field.
And that's the fascinating paradox, isn't it? Because while the system absolutely opened doors for capable people, it also maybe subtly influenced the intellectual elite. It perhaps fostered a kind of submission to state power rather than encouraging truly critical, independent thought. And that dynamic, I think, arguably contributed to this cycle of what you might call low-level turmoil during power changes. Instead of consistently getting truly enlightened leadership from the smartest people, you sometimes got something else. It was a trade-off, you know.
A found trade-off. So as we wrap up this deep dive, here's something for you to really chew on. When systems are designed specifically to find and harness talent for the state, how much real freedom, how much true autonomy do the talented actually gain? And how much do they, perhaps unknowingly, surrender to the very structure that lifted them up in the first place?
The Tang Dynasty laid the foundation, a bloody and turbulent first attempt at meritocracy. But it was the next great dynasty, the Song, that would learn from these hard-won lessons.
They would seize upon a unique moment in history, a power vacuum left by the self-destruction of the old aristocracy, to perfect this system, turning it into the engine that would run China for centuries.
Well, here's the twist. The end of the Tang Dynasty was just incredibly chaotic, widespread turmoil, warfare.
Right, the instability you mentioned.
And during that chaos, the Western Guanlong bloc and the Eastern aristocratic clans, these pillars of the old system, they basically wiped each other out.
Wow. So they destroyed themselves.
Pretty much. And the really profound consequence, the actual study of genealogy, all those meticulous family records, it just got lost, vanished in the chaos.
So by the time the Song came along,
By the time the Song Dynasty emerged, texts like the 100 family surnames, which used to define who was noble and who wasn't, were just simple reading primers for kids. They didn't distinguish noble from commoner anymore.
That is incredible. So the old aristocracy was just
Gone, which unexpectedly cleared the deck completely for the Song rulers. It gave them this unprecedented chance to recruit officials directly from the general population.
An open field.
Exactly. The court could suddenly cast a much wider net, and boy, did they. The numbers are just staggering.
Yeah. Give us some examples.
Okay, Emperor Taizong, the founder, averaged about 9 Jinshi. These are the presented scholars, the top graduates per year.
Okay, 9 a year.
His successor, Taizong, averaged 50 a year. Then Emperor Zhenzong, 78 a year. And by Emperor Renzong's time, they were selecting an average of 113 Jinshi every single year.
113 a year? That's huge.
It's enormous. Over the whole dynasty, about 320 years, the Song selected more than 110,000 officials from common backgrounds.
No.
The annual average was like 4 to 5 times higher than the Tang, Ming, and Qing dynasties combined. It's no wonder later scholars often said the House of Zhao was good to scholars. They really opened the doors.
But was it just about filling empty spots?
Mm-hmm.
Or was there more to it?
Oh, much more. There was a deep strategic reason behind this massive scale. The Song rulers had learned the Tang's lesson the hard way.
Right, the instability problem.
Exactly. They could not afford to have talented commoners, the ones passing these tough exams, ending up serving rival states like the Liao and Jin on their borders. That was a constant threat.
National security.
Precisely. The statesman Ouyang Zhu famously said, "The Northwest is close to the barbarians. Scholars must be kept in the fold." It wasn't just about meritocracy. It was about keeping the best minds working for the Song, not against them.
That adds a whole different layer to it. So did that strategic thinking show up in the exam system itself, like quotas or something?
It did, actually. It's sort of like modern college entrance exams, where different regions might have different admission targets. The KeJu had quotas too, called Ji, for different prefectures and counties. And here's the telling part. During wartime, the strategically vital northwestern regions, their quotas were proportionally way higher, sometimes 10 times higher than regions in the interior.
Wow, really directing talent where they felt they needed it most.
Definitely. But all this success, this huge number of graduates, it also created a kind of ironic problem.
Which was?
Well, even though passing was incredibly prestigious, a lot of these Jinshi graduates actually found themselves unemployed after years of hard study.
Really? After all that?
Yeah. There just weren't enough high-level government jobs to go around for everyone who passed. The scale was massive, but maybe too massive in some ways.
Okay, so this huge influx of scholars kind of highlighted flaws in the existing system then.
Yeah.
What did the exam actually look like before the big reforms?
Right. So before Wang Anshi shook things up, the main Jinshi exam had 4 sessions. It included writing a poem, some rhyming prose called Fu, a general essay, answering 5 policy questions about current events, and showing foundational cultural knowledge.
Poetry and prose seem prominent there.
They were, and that was the critical point. The poem and prose session was seen as the most important. Prose, especially, was highly valued.
Which seems a bit odd, right?
Yeah.
Does writing good poetry make you a good administrator?
Exactly. That's the perplexing part. The logic that a good poet automatically makes a good official is, well, it's flawed, frankly.
Yeah.
And in terms of practical governing, poets were often seen as the least reliable people. Now, maybe this wasn't a huge deal in the Tang Dynasty because Jinshi were only about 10% of the officials.
Okay.
But in the Song, you're holding this exam every 3 years, picking hundreds of the empire's best poets and prose writers, and then asking them to run the country. It was becoming really inefficient.
Enter the reformer.
Enter Wang Anshi, a real visionary. In 1071, he pushed through these dramatic changes. He basically scrapped almost all the other exam subjects and focused everything on the Jinshi exam.
And changed the content?
Completely revised it. Still 4 sessions, but now the first 2 were all about classical texts, exegesis.
Okay, like studying the rule book.
Sort of. Session 1 was the primary classic. Candidates picked one of the 5 classics, these foundational Confucian texts, like an optional routine in diving, maybe.
Got it.
Session 2 was the secondary classics, the Analects and Mencius. Everyone had to do those, like a compulsory routine.
And the other 2 sessions?
Session 3 was an argumentative essay, a lun, and the final session was all policy questions. Candidates had to come up with practical ideas, proposals on 3 current issues facing the empire.
So much more focused on logic and practical application.
Precisely. And this kicked off a huge debate. It's actually surprisingly similar to arguments you still hear today, humanities versus sciences, literary skills versus practical skills.
What was Wang Anqi's main argument?
His core point was pretty sharp. Classical study, essays, policy questions, these test logic, intellect, strategic thinking, essential qualities for an official.
Makes sense.
Poetry and prose, he argued, test imagination, not logic. And illogical people shouldn't be running the government. So, boom, poetry and prose were out.
Did everyone agree?
Not at all. The famous scholar Su Dongpo strongly disagreed, but interestingly, he kind of struggled to give a really convincing reason why poetry was essential for governing. From a purely practical statecraft point of view, you have to say Wang Anqi had a point. You can't be writing fancy couplets when the enemy army is knocking at the gates. You need solutions.
Right, practical solutions or the emperor gets captured.
Yeah.
Which actually happened later, didn't it?
It did, and history loves irony. After the humiliation of Jing Kang, when the northern Song capital fell and the emperor was captured, there was this massive backlash against Wang Anqi's reform.
Blaming the new system.
Exactly. People were saying, see? What was wrong with picking officials based on prose? We governed fine before. Now you switch to these logic guys and look what happened.
Politics hasn't changed much, has it?
Not really. So after the emperor who backed Wang Anqi died, another powerful figure, Sima Guang, brought back the old system. Poetry and prose were back in.
But did it stick that time?
It went back and forth a bit. But eventually, during the Southern Song period, they landed on a compromise. A 2-track system.
2 tracks, like choosing different majors.
Pretty much. You could choose an arts track tested on poetry, prose, essays, policy, or you could choose a science track focused on classical study, essays, policy.
So offering both approaches.
Exactly. And the numbers show the shift. In the Northern Song, only like 1 out of 69 exams had this 2-track option. In the Southern Song, 47 out of 49 exams did. It became the standard.
Okay, so beyond what was tested, the Song also really solidified the how of the exams, right? The structure.
Absolutely. A lot of the rules and institutions we associate with the KeJu system were finalized then, setting the stage for centuries, like the standard 3-stage process.
Break that down for us.
Sure. First, you had the provincial exam, the Jiangshi, that was like a local preliminary round. If you passed, you were called a Juren, a recommended man.
Okay, stage 1.
Stage 2 was the metropolitan exam, the Hushi, held in the capital, run by the Ministry of Rights. Past that, and you finally became a Jinshi, a presented scholar.
The big leagues.
Right. And then stage 3, the palace exam, the Dianshi. This one was personally overseen by the emperor himself. Its main job was to determine the final ranking among the Jinshi.
The emperor himself. Why was that necessary?
The palace exam is really interesting. Its role changed. Initially, the Song emperors introduced it mainly to stop cheating among the sons of high officials. They got a personal retest.
Okay, an anti-corruption measure.
At first. But then a minister made a very clever argument. He said, look, without a final exam run by the emperor, the graduates will feel loyalty only to their chief examiner, the one who passed them at the ministry. Grace comes from the department, he said.
I see.
But with a palace exam for everyone, presided over by the emperor, grace comes from the sovereign.
That's smart politics.
It was a brilliant political engineering. It turned the Jinshi into disciples of the Son of Heaven. It added this powerful, almost teacher-student bond on top of the ruler-subject relationship. Huge for securing loyalty.
And did it stay just for ranking? They didn't fail people at that stage?
Correct. From Emperor Renzong onwards, the palace exam was purely about ranking the Jinshi, who had already passed the metropolitan exam, no eliminations. The announcement of names was this huge public honor.
But the ranking still mattered, I assume.
Oh, absolutely. It was brutal.
Yeah.
They divided the Jinshi into 3 classes. First class was the top 3. The Zhuangyuan Bengyan in Tanhua. They got the title Jinshi in the first rank. Huge prestige.
The absolute elite.
Then the second class got Jinshi origin. Think of it like maybe a standard university degree today. Fully qualified.
Okay.
And the third class, their title was same as Jinshi origin. It conferred recognition, but there was a subtle difference. Maybe like calling someone madam-like instead of madam, or perhaps like an associate degree versus a bachelor's. Still an achievement, but clearly a lower tier.
Wow, fine distinctions. Now, all these stages, these exams, how often could people even take them? It sounds like a massive undertaking.
It really was. And that's why the rule of holding the main exams only once every 3 years became standard during Emperor Yingzong's reign.
Why 3 years?
Pure practicality, mostly.
Yeah.
Transportation back then was just awful. If exams were held every year, someone who failed the metropolitan exam in the autumn would have to immediately rush home hundreds or thousands of miles.
Oh,
Just to prepare for the next spring's provincial exam to qualify again. They'd spend the whole year just traveling with almost no time to actually study.
makes sense. Was it expensive too?
Incredibly expensive. People have estimated the average total cost to become a Jinshi, travel, lodging, books, tutors maybe, was around 400 taels of silver.
Which is a lot.
A huge amount. An ordinary farming family couldn't possibly afford that. So the 3-year cycle helped manage the logistics and the immense personal cost involved.
Okay, so it's difficult, it's expensive,
Yeah.
and presumably people tried to cheat.
Oh, definitely. But the Song Dynasty came up with some truly ingenious anti-cheating methods to ensure fairness. Stuff that was way ahead of its time.
Like what?
Well, the most famous one is the name-covering method, the humingfa. A scribe would literally paste paper over the candidate's name on the exam script so the graders couldn't see who wrote it.
Huh. We still do that today in some places, like with standardized tests.
Exactly. It's a Song Dynasty invention still in use. But they went even further. What if a grader recognized someone's handwriting? Or what if there was a secret code hidden in the essay?
Good point. So what did they do?
Under Emperor Zhenzong, they invented something even more advanced. The transcript copying method, or tenglu fa. Get this.
Yeah.
Special scribes would copy the entire exam paper word for word in red ink.
Copy the whole thing. Why?
That copied version in standardized red ink handwriting was what went to the chief examiner for grading. The original stayed locked away. This made it virtually impossible for a grader to recognize handwriting or spot any hidden marks or codes.
That is incredibly thorough.
It really was. And these systems, the name covering, the transcript copying, they were so effective, so well designed, that the later Ming and Qing dynasties just adopted them wholesale. They became the standard.
So wrapping this up, it's quite a journey. The KeJu system really finding its feet, flourishing in the Song Dynasty.
Yeah, it really did.
It started as this tool to maybe rebalance power back in the Sui and Tang, and evolved into this incredibly durable system that just shaped Chinese society for centuries. It created this path for meritocracy that was, well, pretty revolutionary for its time.
It's an amazing story of adaptation, really. The song sees this unique moment in history, the old aristocracy basically disappearing.
Right, that power vacuum.
And they learned from the Tang's failures through strategic thinking, through reforms like Wang Anshi's. They institutionalized this meritocratic path to power. And like we said, so many of the rules, the anti-cheating measures, they became the gold standard later on.
So ultimately, the Song's KeJu wasn't just about exams, was it? It was much bigger.
Much bigger. It was about the state deliberately cultivating loyalty, tapping into this huge untapped pool of talent across society and trying to govern more effectively in what was often a really dangerous world.
It really makes you think about that balance, between innovation and tradition, and how these historical accidents like the aristocracy wiping itself out can just completely change everything for a nation.
Absolutely. History turning on a dime sometimes.
So what's the takeaway for you listening? Maybe consider this. When we talk today about how we choose our leaders, our officials, how much are we still dealing with that same core tension, that tension between different kinds of skills, the literary, the practical, the intellectual, that Wang Anshi was wrestling with 1,000 years ago?
Yeah, it's a question that hasn't really gone away, has it? The Song Dynasty created a meritocratic marvel, a system of rules and fairness that was centuries ahead of its time. But what happens when such a powerful engine for social mobility runs for hundreds of years?
It doesn't just select talent. It begins to warp the very nature of ambition itself, leading to a phenomenon modern society calls involution. And this is where our story takes its final darkest turn in the Ming and Qing dynasties.
So our mission today for you listening is to try and grasp the sheer scale of that ambition, the incredibly complex layers of competition these people face.
And the impact, right, the lasting impact on individuals and the whole empire.
Definitely. Okay, so let's try and unpack this maze. You'd think getting into an exam system would be, I don't know, relatively straightforward. Fill out a form, show up.
Not quite. Not in the Ming and Qing. It was, like you said, a labyrinth, hurdles right from the very beginning.
So what was the first step?
Well, the Ming actually introduced this really brutal qualifying exam. It was called the
科考
and it acted as this first just merciless filter. It was incredibly effective at, well, thinning the herd.
How effective are we talking?
Get this. In Jiangxi province alone, in just 1 year, over 40,000 people were eliminated at this cacao stage.
40,000 eliminated.
Eliminated. And remember, this is when China's total population was maybe, what, a few tens of millions?
That puts it in perspective. That's an incredible failure rate right at the start.
It really shows the extreme competition,
Wow.
yeah, from step one.
So imagine you actually pass that. The relief must have been immense.
Oh,
You
absolutely.
pass 科考 and you become what was the term? A Tongsheng.
Dongsheng, yeah. Student candidate.
But the celebration probably didn't last long, did it? Because
Yeah.
that wasn't the end, was it?
Not even close. You've basically just earned your spot in the queue, a very, very long queue.
Right. So what's next for the Tongsheng?
So the Tongsheng then had to face the Tongsheng exam itself, another major hurdle.
Okay.
And what's kind of interesting is this wasn't just for young guys. Men in their 70s, even 80s, could sit for this exam. The papers were apparently slightly different depending on age, but still,
Wow. Lifelong ambition for some.
truly. And this Tongsheng exam, it wasn't just one test. It was a series of 3 stages.
3 more.
Yep. First, the county exam, run by the local magistrate. Then, if you pass that, the prefectural exam, run by the prefect.
Getting higher up.
Exactly. And finally, the academy exam, which was overseen by a special education commissioner sent from the central government.
Okay, so county, prefecture, academy.
You got it.
Yeah.
And only if you pass all 3 of those did you finally earn the title of
秀才
Siukai, cultivated talent.
that's the one. And that was the qualification you needed to even think about the next big step, the provincial exam.
Okay, so this
秀才
status, this is where it gets really fascinating for me. You're still not an official, right?
Like, not yet.
But your life changes completely. It's not just about books anymore. It's about status. So help us understand, what did being a
秀才
actually get you? What were the perks?
Well, the Ming and Qing
Qing.
governments, they really emphasized state education. They set up schools, county schools, prefectural schools,
Right.
and
秀才
generally required to study there. But even within
秀才
there were ranks.
More ranks. Of course there were.
Yeah. Yeah, the basic Fuxing, the sort of attached student. Then you had
领
Sheng. These were the stipend students.
Stipend, as in they got paid.
They did. They received state subsidies.
Yeah.
In Zhu Yuanzhang's time, it was something like 6 du of rice a month. That's about 35 kilograms, enough to feed a small family.
Wow. So the state is literally feeding you to study.
Exactly. The term lin actually means granary.
Mm.
And then above them, you have
贡士
the tribute students who got sent to the Imperial Academy in the capital
So even once you're in, you're still competing fiercely within that group.
constantly. But the general
秀才
status itself came with some pretty remarkable privileges, especially compared to earlier dynasties like the Tang and Song.
Like what tangible benefits are we talking about?
Okay, so first, you got the right to wear specific robes, sort of like a 9th rank official.
So you looked the part.
You looked the part.
Mhm.
Crucially, you didn't have to kneel before local officials.
That's a big deal in that kind of hierarchical society.
Huge. You also had immunity from arbitrary arrest. A local official couldn't just throw you in jail. They needed the okay from the county school instructor.
Wow.
And get this, assaulting is
秀才
was treated as seriously as assaulting an actual official.
So real protection.
Real protection, plus exemption from corvée labor, that's the forced state labor
秀才
by himself, and 2 other male family members.
Okay, so what does that all add up to? It means is
秀才
even without an actual government job, had this special protected status. They were sort of semi-official, almost untouchable by the local powers.
That's a good way to put it. They wielded significant social influence. It was a major step up,
A huge step up from just being a commoner scholar.
definitely. So if becoming a
秀才
is maybe like getting your, I don't know, bachelor's degree today, a big deal, but not the final step for the highest flyers,
Right.
then the next major hurdle, the real make or break moment for serious ambition, was the provincial exam, the Jiangxi.
Okay, the provincial exam, this sounds like it was on a different scale altogether.
Oh, absolutely. Much grander than those earlier exams.
Right.
Remember, some Tongsheng might have been writing outside in the rain or whatever.
Right.
The provincial exam, held every 3 years, was a spectacle. The county magistrate would host a farewell banquet, give travel money. Candidates might travel to the provincial capital on boats flying banners that said, attending the provincial exam by imperial decree.
Wow, quite the procession.
Yeah. And the exams themselves took place in these massive dedicated compounds, the Gongyuan. The one in Nanjing, for example, could supposedly hold over 24,000
秀才
at once.
24,000 in exam cells. That's mind-boggling scale.
But it really hammers home the importance of this stage.
But okay, grand setting, imperial decree.
Right.
What were the odds? Because I imagine with that many people, the competition was still insane.
Insane is the word. Brutal acceptance rates. During the Qianlong era, for instance, in a large province, your chances were maybe 1 in 80.
1 in 80.
Medium provinces, maybe 1 in 60. That's like 1.7%. Small provinces, slightly better, maybe 1 in 50.
Those are terrible odds. No wonder you hear stories like Fan Jin in that novel, The Scholars.
Exactly. Fan Jin from Guangdong, which was a medium province, he passes, and he just goes completely delirious with joy, literally loses his mind for a bit.
You can almost understand it facing odds like that. The pressure must have been immense.
Unimaginable. And passing this, becoming a Juren, master Juren, was a huge leap.
Okay, so
举人
what did that mean compared to...
秀才
It was a massive step up. In earlier dynasties, being a
举人
was often just a ticket to the next exam. But in the Ming and
金
it became a lifelong qualification. Think of it like a permanent diploma or degree.
So it stuck with you.
It stuck. And the privileges were greater too. An 8th rank official robe, so a step up from
秀才
an exemption from labor, not just for a couple of family members, but for your entire family.
The whole family. Okay, that's significant.
Very. But the most crucial difference,
举
could
人
actually become officials.
Ah, so this is where the path to actual power opens up.
Precisely. Take the Jiarjing era in the Ming. Only about 10% of county magistrates were actually Jinshi the guys who passed the next level. That left a lot of lower and mid-level positions open for these.
举人
Okay, that explains the Fan Jin story better. Why Squire Zhang gives him a house in silver.
Exactly. Because it
举人
truly made it ashore, as they said. They were now plugged into the system, someone with real influence and prospects.
What about all those
秀才
who didn't pass the provincial exam? There must have been thousands upon thousands of them.
A huge number. And they ended up in this kind of awkward, unfulfilled position.
Yeah.
You can maybe draw a parallel, though imperfect, to the samurai in Japan during the peaceful Edo period.
How so?
Well, with no wars to fight, many samurai became sort of idle, sometimes lording it over commoners, focusing on the rituals of Bushido rather than practical skills.
Okay, I see the connection.
These,
秀才
stuck at that level, often wandered around villages, maybe showing off their knowledge of the classics, but not really contributing productively. Some accounts describe them contributing to a kind of weakening and dispirited populace.
That sounds potentially problematic on a larger scale.
It does. And some historians have drawn a line, perhaps controversially, between this phenomenon, this large class of educated but underemployed, potentially detached elites,
Yeah.
and the shocking speed with which the Ming dynasty collapsed when the
金
did.
You mean like 200,000 king soldiers versus a population of 50 million?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Was part of the problem an intellectual class, too, focused on the rituals of the exam system and disconnected from the practical needs of governing and defense? It's a heavy question.
Definitely something to think about. So the Juren had made it ashore, but for the absolute top tier, the journey wasn't over.
Not at all. For those aiming for the real centers of power, the ministries, the Grand Secretariat, the next step was the metropolitan exam in the capital,
会
the
试
Hushi.
Okay, the metropolitan exam. How big a deal was passing this one?
Massive. Well, a
举人
could get a decent post. The difference in career trajectory between a
举人
and a jinshi, someone who passed the metropolitan exam, was described as like clouds and mud.
Clouds and mud. That's quite a contrast.
It really was. There's a saying, no one enters the Hanlin Academy unless they are a jinshi.
And the Hanlon Academy was the pipeline to the top jobs.
Exactly. And no one enters the Grand Secretariat unless they are from the Hanlin Academy. So if you topped out as a
举人
you might end your career as, say, a section chief, a respectable position, but not the heights of power.
So the Jinshi was the key to the inner circle. What about those who passed the metropolitan exam? Were they Jinshi right away?
Almost. Technically, after passing the
会试
were called gomshi, tribute scholars. They had one more step,
One more. Good grief.
the final stage, the palace exam.
殿试
The palace exam. In front of the emperor?
Well, presided over by the emperor, yes. But interestingly, this exam didn't actually eliminate anyone who had already passed the metropolitan exam.
Oh.
So what was the point? Ranking. It was purely about determining the final order of merit for the Jinshi. It was the emperor's personal stamp of approval, deciding who got the top honors.
And what did they test? Still those classical essays.
Mostly policy questions, actually, though the style changed. In the early
因
under the Shunzi emperor, they were apparently very practical. He supposedly asked, quite directly, where can I get some money? Think of a way for me.
Straight to the point.
Right. But later, under emperors like Qianlong, the questions became much more, well, literary, maybe even pretentious. Less practical problem solving.
Okay. And after the exam?
4 days later, there was this incredibly grand ceremony called the Chuanlu. All the officials, all the new Jinshi, would gather at the Hall of Supreme Harmony. The emperor himself would attend and personally announce the names. Imagine the honor.
Incredible.
And the emperor would also personally decide the top 10 rankings and meet with those top 10 guys. This is called the Lesser Chuanlu.
The emperor's chosen few.
Exactly. Though even they could mess up. There's this funny story from the Kangxi era.
Oh, yeah.
Apparently, 2 candidates made the top 10, got the summons for the Lesser Chuanlu, and missed it.
They missed meeting the emperor. How?
Legend has it they were out somewhere eating stewed giblets.
You're kidding!
Nope. And the consequence, they were immediately demoted to the very bottom rank of the Jinshi.
Ouch. After all that work. Undone my snacks.
A cautionary tale. But look, if we're talking Ming and
Qin,
exams, we absolutely have to address the elephant in the room, the most criticized part,
Right.
the 8-legged essay.
Right, the Baguin. What exactly was it, and why does it get such a bad rap?
So it was a specific style of essay, usually based on interpreting lines from the Confucian 4 books and 5 classics. Crucially, Emperor Zhu Yuanzhang had decreed that interpretations had to follow the commentary of the Song philosopher Zhu Ji.
Okay, so restricted interpretation from the start.
Yes, and then there was the structure. Incredibly rigid, 8 distinct sections or legs. The middle 4 sections, especially, had these strict rules about parallel prose, antithetical couplets. Very complex formatting.
So form over content, potentially.
That became the big problem, the unintended consequence. Scholars started spending all their time mastering the form, studying model essays, learning how to structure these perfect 8-legged arguments according to Zhu Ji's views.
And less time on the actual classics.
Exactly. They stopped deeply engaging with the original texts. It led to absurd situations, like supposedly some Ming Jinshi guys who passed the highest exam didn't even know basic historical facts, like which dynasty the famous statesman Fan Zhongyan belonged to.
Because they only studied the essay structure, not the context.
Precisely. It became an exercise in stylistic imitation, stifling original thought and broad learning.
You can see why it was criticized, especially later on.
Definitely. By the late
Qin,
after repeated military defeats by Western powers, there was a huge push to get rid of it, to modernize.
Makes sense. Time for reform.
But there's this really insightful counterpoint from an official named Zhang Tingyu. When people were clamoring to abolish the 8-legged essay, he asked, basically, okay, fine, abolish it. What are you going to replace it with?
Good question.
His point was, an exam system is okay as long as it selects intelligent people. What you test isn't necessarily the most important thing. Food for thought, right?
It really is. So what happened? Did they reform it?
Well, there was a plan. In 1901, Zhang Zhidong, who became Minister of Education, proposed a gradual approach.
Okay.
His idea was, let's set up modern schools, teach science, technology, practical subjects. And over 10 years, we'll slowly phase out the old essay system. Stable, measured reform.
Sounds sensible.
But then, Kang Yue, a more radical reformer, persuaded the Guangxi emperor. And in 1905, boom, on impulse, the emperor abolished the entire
KeJu
system. Just like that.
The whole thing, not just the essay.
The whole centuries-old system. Gone. Overnight.
Wow. What were the consequences of such an abrupt change?
Pretty immediate and, frankly, catastrophic. Zhang Zhidong hadn't had time to build many new schools yet. So suddenly, the main path for scholars to gain status and position just vanished.
Oh.
So where did they go? Abroad. Tens of thousands flooded into Japan looking for modern education and opportunity.
Tens of thousands.
Yeah. And where did
Sun Zhongshan,
found his revolutionary alliance that
同盟会,
aimed at overthrowing the dynasty?
Let me guess. Tokyo.
In Tokyo. Full of these disaffected scholars. And just 7 years after it
KeJu,
was abolished, the Qing
Qing.
dynasty fell.
It really raises that question, doesn't it? Even well-intentioned reforms, if done too abruptly without a safety net, can be profoundly destabilizing.
A stark lesson in unintended consequences.
So what an incredible system we've explored. The KeJu
科举
called China's fifth great invention. This journey from those brutal local qualifiers, the key
科考
through the
秀才举人
ranks, the immense pressure of the provincial exam, right up to the emperor at the palace exam.
And then its sudden dramatic end.
It really does feel like this ultimate example of involution, this intense centuries-long competition.
Absolutely, and its impact is hard to overstate. It shaped the entire relationship between the intellectual class and political power in China for centuries. It deeply influenced, you could argue, the very formation of the Chinese national character. It's just fundamental to understanding later Chinese history.
So maybe the final thought for everyone listening is, what does this historical deep dive mean for us today? Do we see similar involutionary rat races in our own societies? Maybe in education or careers where competition intensifies, but the real rewards don't necessarily grow.
That focus on form over substance, perhaps.
Yeah. And what happens when a really established path, even a flawed one, is suddenly removed? Especially if there isn't a clear, robust alternative ready to take its place.
Definitely something worth pondering.
Indeed. Something to think about until our next deep dive.
If you found this discussion useful, maybe learned something new, definitely hit that subscribe button. We do these deep dives regularly, exploring valuable ideas.
We appreciate you tuning in.
Yeah, thanks for joining us.